Welcome, fellow castigators. Everything you've heard is true. David Corenswet is a great Superman in an incredibly mid-Superman movie. It's like if Michael Keaton had agreed to be in Batman Forever. In fact, the whole movie is kind of like that, with great casting like Nicholas Hoult, Eddie Gathegi, or however you want to say that, and Rachel Brosnahan, who's absolutely perfect as Lois Lane.
Look at that subtle off-white coloring. The tasteful thickness of it. Oh my god.
Unfortunately, though, the story is all over the place, telling more than showing, and is so obsessed with its absolute DMVQ worth of side characters that it nearly forgets Superman himself. The only time we see Superman fighting by himself, he loses badly. Every other fight is more focused on the Justice Gang, who end up doing most of the work in the end. You kind of get the idea that maybe James Gunn doesn't even know how to make something other than a quirky ensemble film. Audiences have been absolutely starved for good live-action Superman content since 1980, begging for scraps and receiving only the most bitter morsels. So it's pretty crazy to reboot Superman after 45 years of cinematic garbage with a movie that doesn't feature much Superman. However, it's for the same reason that there are plenty of people who really enjoyed the film. This Superman embodies hope in a way we haven't seen since 2006, without all of the weird, creepy stalker stuff. It's great to see a Superman that's positive and colorful, rather than the strangely naked-looking, overly severe, green-tinted, IHOP version of Superman we got over a decade ago. So, as mediocre as it is, James Gunn's Superman is still the third best Superman film so far. Right under Superman 2 and just slightly over Superman 3. I just wish it wasn't such a James Gunn movie. The frenetic story beats, the bloated cast of characters, and worst of all, the humor that undercuts nearly every sincere moment. It's like we're not allowed to feel things because we must be made acutely aware at all times of what a funny, funny man James Gunn is. Commitment to the bit is for comedies, not Superman movies. Even Richard Pryor knew he needed to downplay everything. Anyway, if you're just looking for a happy, fun, and forgettable time in the theater, then you could do a lot worse than James Gunn's Superman. But if you're like me and you were hoping to finally get another knockout, then you might want to just forget about this one. Now on to spoilers. I still can't get over the fact that the movie opens with a wall of text, and then a silly crypto scene. We don't get to see Superman do a bunch of cool stuff. We're forced to read and hear about it. And then on top of that, so much of the runtime is filled up by that stupid dog. Sure, he's cute, but what else? Is he important to the plot, the story, the characters? No, it's just because James Gunn had to have his quirky little animals. Thank God the studio made him cut out the squirrel Green Lantern. They kept in the stupid mutant monkeys, though, so that Gunn could bring up the absolute brilliance that is #supershit one more time. What is with all the cursing in this movie anyway? I know that it's realistic and it helps to contrast with Superman, who doesn't talk like that. But does it have to be so severe and so frequent? It's like James Gunn absolutely must push the boundaries of PG-13 every time he makes a superhero film, that honestly should be more accessible to children than that. More annoyingly, I felt that the villains in this story are pretty weak. First, you have the engineer, who has no motivation or character development. Her powers are the ever-lazy nanobite technology that's barely indistinguishable from magic. In addition to that, she looks like an anorexic member of a G.I. Joe sequel. Secondly, you have Ultraman, a cross between Bizarro and Brendan Fraser. What's so incredibly stupid about this character is how Lex Luthor manages to verbally call out fight moves faster than Superman can react. With that system, Ultraman should have been pummeled to the ground with relative ease. Thirdly, of course, is Lex Luthor, who isn't really given motivation for his hatred of Superman. The excuse is that we're well into the story when the movie begins, but in the infamous "Where's the Dog" scene, it's established that this is Superman and Lex Luthor meeting for the first time. There's a throwaway line about how Luthor gets a significant portion of land as part of his deal with the fictional Middle Eastern country, and will use it to create his own utopia. This would be a good motivation for him to hate Superman, as he definitely doesn't fit into Luthor's idea of a utopia. The plan is also very on brand for Lex Luthor, and should have been the larger plot, instead of all these efforts being for the sole purpose of humiliating Superman. Even worse than the villains is the strange pacing of this movie. After the text wall, the crypto scene, and Superman getting whooped by Ultraman, they cut to Lois's apartment where she and Clark are practically banging each other on the countertop. We don't get any real introduction to these characters before we're thrown into scenes where we're meant to feel things that we couldn't possibly feel yet. Sure, it was smart of Gunn to realize that we don't need to see an origin story again, but we still need to know what kind of people our lead characters are, how they think, how they feel, why we should root for them. Your audience shouldn't feel like they accidentally walked in on two strangers making out in a closet. The Justice Gang doesn't fare much better. Green Lantern is just a quippy quipster, Mr. Terrific is entirely stoic, and Hawkgirl doesn't get any development other than knowingly murdering a man. At least Mr. Terrific is pretty cool. I don't think our future outlook is much too bright either, considering our introduction to Supergirl. I think Millie Alcock is a great choice, but just like with Superman, we've skipped over a significant part of her story. She speaks English, is very Americanized, and for some reason didn't tell her cousin what Krypton and his parents were really like. Which, by the way, should have been faked by Luthor. The lack of resolution for this made the ending feel very unsatisfying for me. Anyway, Supergirl is introduced as a drunk who doesn't respect Superman. We're told she goes to planets with a red sun so that she can get drunk, but is somehow still wasted after being exposed to the yellow sun for some time, considering she had to fly from an entirely different galaxy. It doesn't help that her movie will be based on Tom King's Woman of Tomorrow, one of the worst Supergirl comics ever written. I'm sure the inclusion of Krypto will make it even better. Next, I'd like to rate this movie based on a video I made a while ago about the 10 things I'd like to see in the next Superman movie. For context, this was back when we were rudely tricked into believing that Henry Cavill would be back to finally get the movie he deserves. I will be giving the film 1 point for every item that it featured. Number 1. Clark Kent and Lois Lane doing actual journalism. I thought it was fun how in the original films the plot ties into something that Lois and Clark are investigating, a setup that works well enough that they were able to make a whole TV show out of it. In this movie, you get the overly long scene of Lois interviewing Superman, and then a very weak wrap-up of the Daily Planet people using the T-Craft to expose Luthor. I'm very annoyed that the Daily Planet staff were so well casted and costumed, minus Jimmy's lack of bow tie, but then barely had anything to do with the plot. It's almost like the story should have been about Superman and his characters, instead of the whole DC universe. 0 points. Number 2. Patriotism. I've always loved how patriotic Superman is in the original comic run and in Christopher Reeve films, and it's about time they brought it back, especially since my generation hates America and seems to think it's an evil place. Instead, they go out of their way to show a scene where Luthor points out that Superman isn't an American and doesn't have rights. On the contrary, Clark was legally adopted by the Kents and is a tax-paying citizen of the United States. Top authority figures would know this, either by way of confirmation from the Justice Gang who know his secret identity, or by way of safe assumption through Clark's articles, where he frequently reveals too much about his past. After all, that's the only reason that everyone knows he's an alien. On a funnier note, the producers have admitted in interviews that this Superman has done poorly internationally because of anti-American sentiment, which means they could have gone a whole hog on the patriotism anyway. 0 points. Number 3. Jimmy Olsen gets something to do. In this film, Jimmy Olsen is finally recognized as the sex symbol that he is, and furthermore, his sacrifice and dedication to journalism turns out to be vital in taking down Lex Luthor. Now that's what I'm talking about. Finally, 1 point. Number 4. Underwear. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous that Man of Steel in the New 52 would take away something so tried and true, and it was annoying to see it permeate into other media. Superman's color balance is just thrown off so much without the trunks. Thankfully, David Corenswet's Superman costume looks great. I'm not the biggest fan of the slight collar or the material, but the colors, the belt, and the notched boots are on point. My favorite part of the costume has to be the excellently chosen cape material and the yellow symbol back in its rightful place. 2 points! Number 5. Contrast between Clark Kent and Superman. Something we love to see is Clark's criticism of the human race through his nerdy journalist persona, but how in reality he's a corn-fed hick, which comes out when he's Superman or otherwise not putting on a show for other journalists. Christopher Reeve and Dean Cain do a really good job of playing this trifecta of personality traits, but just about every other live-action Superman largely ignores it. We don't really get to see much of David Corenswet as Clark Kent, although there are glimmers of the redneck in Superman's personality. I'm tempted to give this half a point, but I won't. Still only 2 points. Number 6. Brainiac. I've been tired of Superman fighting villains with Superman powers, like Zod, an evil doppelganger, Nuclear Man, and Doomsday, so I think it's about time he goes up against Brainiac, who is underutilized in live action anyway. Obviously, we got Ultraman instead. Still 2 points. Number 7. Colorfulness. As I've said before, I'd like superhero movies to be more colorful, like the comics, and less like The Matrix. This movie doesn't really have a consistent and nice-to-look-at color palette, but it at least has colors that pop. That's 3 points. Number 8. A period piece, perhaps. In my video, I floated the suggestion that maybe Superman would work better in a time of limited technology, and could perhaps be more artful if represented through an Art Deco style. It was more of an idea rather than a requirement, but that's a point lost nonetheless. Number 9. The inclusion of Supergirl. She isn't really featured as part of the plot, but she is in the movie and is getting a spin-off as I suggested. So fair is fair. 4 points. Last but not least, number 10. Nothing stupid. One of the ongoing problems with Superman movies is that all of them feature something so bizarre that you have to focus your will to ignore that particular aspect and enjoy the movie. James Gunn's Superman has a few things that we could point to, but obviously the betrayal of Kal-El's parents is the worst offender of all. I know it's supposed to lead to a cute moment where he appreciates his Earth parents, but even then it doesn't need to be that way. Just have him bemoan that he doesn't know more about his birth parents and then learn to appreciate the Kents as the story goes on. Instead, we just get a questionable line about how parents aren't supposed to tell you who to be. So the Kents never told Clark to be a good boy? Anyhow, based on my personal wish list, the new Superman film gets a disappointing 4 out of 10 points. I think there are parts of this that I enjoyed enough to bring it up to a 5, or maybe even a 6 just for how thermonuclear hot Lois Lane is, but I won't rig the results. Overall, Superman is a mediocre, disappointing film with decent visuals, timid music, and an absurdly messy script. I don't think that James Gunn's DCU will be the big revival that we hoped for, and I think they're going to have to learn how to work with smaller budgets from now on. Maybe less money laundering would be a good idea. Thanks for listening.